to Director Hubbard to get us started.
Thank you, Chair. The first thing we're going to do is take a few minutes to just recap what we heard last meeting. We're not going to spend a lot of time revisiting the policy actions and the outcomes, but for each of those, I do want to just reflect back what we heard. It's important that people that took the time to make comments, commissioners that made comments, that you see that your voices were heard, and that we'll use that as we all work together collectively to move forward around our next funding round grant policy. But I do want to use the bulk of the time to talk about the Unified Housing Strategy recommendations and leave some time at the end for additional public comment as we promised the audience. Next slide. So the first thing that we talked about were funding caps. You can see what we discussed around the policy actions and outcomes from raising the caps and that impact on limited investments, and the work session feedback that was captured was considered, especially in tight funding years, right-sizing funding caps as well as funding tracks. And we'll talk about the funding tracks when we get into the UHS discussion. We also talked about open contracts with unexpended funds and what the policy actions and outcomes there were. And the feedback that we heard were consider allowing multiple open contracts for projects with distinct phases and being clear on defining what a project is. And then there was a lot of discussion around not allowing additional funding, though, in certain projects like the same building that already has Barnes funding. So that's the summary of the feedback we heard there. Around team capacity and experience, this is largely around the nonprofit for-profit partnerships and the complications of reviewing those. And the work session feedback was establishing mechanisms that make it clear that the nonprofit partner is the one driving the project, defining what meaningful ownership by a nonprofit looks like, as well as strengthening evaluation of nonprofit leadership, of the nonprofit leadership role in decision-making and long-term stewardship. Around the financial capacity discussion, this is where we talked about using sources and uses budget, or the template, the demonstration of financial commitments and audit requirements. The work session feedback was centered around balancing first money in versus development readiness and speed to market. The next really focused on requiring audited financials as a threshold requirement to enable staff and evaluators to evaluate the financial health of an organization at application, and then holding funding round workshops on financial capacity requirements before we actually open a round so that potential applicants can get an understanding of what's going to be required. There was a robust discussion around bonus points, rightfully so. The work session feedback was around scaling points based on the extent an application meets criteria rather than just giving all the points if there's just a little bit of achieving that policy goal in a bonus point section. The others points were around applying bonus points equitably across project types and then determining how bonus points should be used. We actually have had a lot of internal discussion with our team around should bonus points be more of a tiebreaker rather than trying to advance policy goals? So we'll have some of that conversation as we get into the UHS discussion. And then finally, the last section we reviewed or we discussed was around the evaluation and award process. We clearly heard bring back the scoring matrix, prioritizing scoring centered around UHS goals, separate funding tracks for project types, and determining how co-ops should be evaluated. So we heard all that discussion loud and clear. We look forward as we we have a next step slide at the very, very end where we'll talk about how we're going to use this information and the results from the discussion today to move forward. But I'll pause there quickly to hear from the commission if there's anything that we didn't reflect back before we move into the UHS discussion.
All right. Commissioners, are there any themes or items that you feel are not represented? All right, thank you
All
very
right,
much.
thank you. Okay, well, let's get into the unified housing recommendations. I'm going to check my watch to make sure I don't, so it's 3 o'clock. I really want to give probably no more 30 minutes to this, maybe a little bit longer to give the commission time to have dialogue, but also have enough opportunity for comment. So the purpose of this is to talk about general UHS recommendations as well as Barnes-specific recommendations that are in the Unified Housing Strategy. For each of the areas that we're going to touch on, we're going to talk about timelines and actions needed both by the commission as well as what might need legislative action by the council and what can just be policy implementations at staff level. And then we'll conclude by hearing from members of the public. So the first area to discuss around the Unified Housing Strategy is how to incorporate policy priorities among all housing programs that are publicly funded. This isn't just Barnes specific, but we have other initiatives. We have the Catalyst Fund. We have some pilot programs. We're working on new tools. These are the areas that the needs assessment, the themes that were elevated are saying we need to focus on our public investment. This is around long-term affordability or even perpetual affordability being a high priority of the Unified Housing Strategy, addressing the gap around deeply affordable housing. That's housing affordable to households with incomes at or below 30% of the area median income. Providing housing stability for older adults, single-parent households, and persons with disabilities. We found that these special populations are the ones most vulnerable to the drive until you qualify or can find a home theme that was elevated in the UHS. The other is around tenant protections. We can, to the extent that we are allowed in our public programs, introduce stronger mechanisms to increase housing security for renters. And we've taken some measures already in our programs, such as now in the Barnes Fund, we have a limitation that there's no increase in a tenant's portion of the rent during a lease term, even if it's a tax credit project where the AMI might go up. That means the fair market rent might go up and a tenant's rent. If the tenant has a voucher, the voucher can support that difference, but the tenant cannot be required to pay more during that lease term. So we're also starting, I believe with round 13, requiring annual eviction reports with projects that are being completed. And so we're looking at more and more how we can, though, increase housing security for tenants. And then the last priority is around home ownership, both as creating opportunities for home ownership as well as protecting vulnerable homeowners in the housing that they have. And so the actions that is required to implement these policy priorities is the Housing Division leading on working with not only within our team on the tools we have, but with partners that have other housing programs like the Housing Authority or housing adjacent, similar types of housing programs to implement these policy priorities, as well as coordinating funding opportunities. MDHA has funding opportunities that are often complementary to the Barnes Fund. How can we better align our funding opportunities so that we're calling for the same priorities and not confusing applicants? And then within the Barnes Fund itself, integrating policy priorities. And this is a discussion that the bonus points kind of led us to is should we introduce these policy priorities or advance them through evaluation criteria or through bonus points, establishing contractual requirements around the priorities that we want to make sure are upheld throughout the term of the entire affordability period, not just during the contract. And then an action required by the commission would be approval of grant policies and funding timelines. So I'll pause there to give the commission an opportunity to provide some feedback or ask questions around these policy priorities.
I did see that when it comes to like homeowner occupied rehab, that it was like 1%, right? Like, I think 500,000, something around there, was given to those kind of projects. Do you think that that's based off of the rubric that's given? Do you think that was just based off of the need? Because even when I hear people speaking, there's a lot of people in that organization, in those kind of organization brackets, but they seem to get a disproportional amount of funding.
So when we had the funding track discussion a little bit later in the presentation, we did an analysis of 4 funding rounds to see what's been requested versus what's been allocated or awarded. But there are 2 big types of owner-occupied rehab happening in the city. One is through the Barnes Fund, and we partner with nonprofits. Then MDHA has a home repair program funded by the Community Development Block Grant. They have a weatherization program that's funded by the Department of Energy. And those applicants, those homeowners directly apply to MDHA, and MDHA works with private contractors. Sometimes they might partner with the nonprofit. So there are a couple of different ways owner-occupied rehab is happening. We are the ones that's working directly with nonprofits. The Unified Housing Strategy also has, I think it's about 1.7 million for anti-displacement homeowner initiatives that lives outside of the Barnes Fund that will be looking to partner with organization or organizations to really focus on codes violations, being nimble there when a homeowner is at a very close to losing their home because they're not able to keep it up. So there are multiple ways that we're looking to address keeping vulnerable homeowners, especially older adults and persons with disabilities in their homes, and the Barnes Fund is a critical part of that.
Director, I feel like there's been some conversation just to pick up on the older adults. I know that the assessor's office spends a lot of time when they do the reassessment to reach out to folks who may qualify for some of their different programs. Are there any opportunities identified within the UHS to work with them to, whether it's with some of the partner organizations that do rehab or other ways to figure out for those types of situations, are there opportunities to either share information or otherwise increase opportunity for homeowners to be aware of those programs?
Yes, the UHS does acknowledge and the importance of that program. It also, we have a whole action item around homeowners are not aware of a lot of the housing resources we have, or even renters in the city, or even how to connect with them. So there's an action around how within Metro, we can create more of a clearinghouse of resources, and we're working with partners and Hub Nashville on that. Would love to figure out a campaign through our partners here to also advertise other resources available. We have started an informal partnership with codes to where when they are going to a vulnerable homeowner's house that's had a code violation that hasn't been corrected, they actually contact one of my team members, and that team member goes there and does share about those additional resources too, because if somebody's having to look at a tax bill versus being able to have other decisions they're having to make and also having home repair needs, he's able to help connect all of those things. But we are not good as a city of really making all the programs that are available known, and we need to dramatically increase outreach in those respects.
Appreciate that.
I don't see permanent supportive housing listed as a specific priority. I have a feeling it probably layers into some of these other categories, but could you speak to how you see that fitting in?
Permanent supportive housing has its own, addressing housing for persons experiencing homelessness has its own strategy item within the UHS, and with that, there are several action items. Of course, speaking to vulnerable populations is reflected in that deeply affordable. The reason PSH has the separate strategy and actions is that it's so complicated. It requires support beyond capital funding that the Barnes Fund provides, the operational support that's required, the supportive services that's required, the qualifications of partners to really execute on that. And that's why we do have funding in our operating budget to create a permanent supportive housing strategy, working with the Office of Homeless Services, the Homelessness Planning Council, Continuum of Care, MDHA, and others to really not just understand the resources that are required for each of those really verticals, that the capital, the operating, the supportive. We fall very short as a city, as a state, and where these resources can come from. So how do we make that up? What are the right types of partners that we need to have? How do we build the capacity for partners? And then finally, what are the right types of models to get that urgency that Mr. Rizzo elevates? Is it motel conversions? Is it utilizing public land? Is it requiring some PSH in projects, a portion of projects that we award funding to? So those are the things we'll be working through with that permanent supportive housing strategy that then can feed into how we want to fund PSH through the Barnes Fund. And we look forward to your expertise in this area.
To me, I'd like to keep like special populations as, I guess, not vague, but as flexible as possible, just because there's things we don't think about, like project return wouldn't fall into one of these special populations, but I would consider it a special population. And then I guess one interesting case is the Arts Business Council. They determined that the biggest problem facing artists in Nashville is not enough houses, and they made it even like they made it a sort of special population, even though it wouldn't fit any specific guideline. But I like maintaining flexibility there rather than having a list and trying to be exhaustive.
Thank you. And the UHS, and I'm sorry it's not listed, special populations, we consider also persons with deep housing barriers that may have that Project Return or other organizations may assist. And so, but I hear you and made that note. We'll move on to the next area, which, funding tracks. So this is what the UHS recommended. A 60% of funding going toward rental housing with deeper incentives for permanent supportive housing. Also supporting rental rehab through this. It does recommend moving to a loan structure, which we'll talk separately about. Let's right now focus on funding tracks, and which a loan structure could allow for profits. It recommends another tract with ownership that would include or support owner-occupied rehab for 80% of our AMI, prioritizing first-generation homeowners that has some challenges in our current climate, and allowing nonprofits or nonprofit partnerships, as well as having a loan program, and then setting aside capacity building at 10% for to build the capacity and expertise of small nonprofits, very similar to our existing set aside. Next slide. But we did some analysis. This is what I mentioned to you earlier when Commissioner Thomas was talking about rehab allocations. So we looked at funding rounds 10, 11, 13, and 15. Round 10 was when the first funding round when Barnes was moved under planning. 12 and 14 were very ARPA specific. So it doesn't really reflect and not really open it up for the wider ecosystem of project types. So we when we looked across all of these, and this is the aggregates, little over 20%, 26% of the applications we received in those four funding rounds were for homeowner projects, 63.74% were for rental, and 9.89 were for owner-occupied rehab. Of the awards made, 25.4% were for projects for homeownership, 63.49 for rental, and then 11.11 for owner-occupied rehab. When we look at how much money's been requested, though, because owner-occupied rehab doesn't request as much money as rental or homeownership, so that brings down that percentage of requested. We, nearly 28% of the requested amount was for homeownership projects, nearly 70% for rental, and then a little under 3% for owner-occupied rehab. And then finally, at the very end, what was recommended for awards. And this is everything that's been approved. Of course, over the course of the year, some projects didn't move forward, but this is ultimately what was approved by the commission and council. 27.4% of the recommended awards that have been recommended have been for homeownership projects. Rental has been a little bit over 70%, and 2.3 has been for owner-occupied rehab. Below, you can see what the small organization breakdown was. Co-ops, there was a cooperative application in round 11 and 2 in round 15. Those were part of the homeowner. And so we broke it down so you can see what that looked like. The co-op that was funded was actually in a special round in round 12, so that's not reflected here. But that's a consistent among the 4 funding rounds of how we've seen requests and awards come in among the project types. So with that, we would recommend maybe an alternate, next slide, funding tracks with 70% rental, 27% ownership, and 3% rehab, and not have rehab compete as part of the ownership, home ownership funding track. It would have a separate one, and then keep the small org set aside across all project types. You will see that we would recommend bringing the small org set aside down from 20 to 10%. It's 20% in code right now, but we have never awarded in any funding round more than 10% of the awards to small organizations, and that's just, I don't see that trending up. We can keep it there, but this is just based on the analysis that we did. So this would be where we would be looking to recommend potential funding tracks beginning with round 16. So I'll pause there for discussion, and we can go back to the bigger slide or the data slide if you want, or keep it here.
Thank you.
As someone who reviewed the rental track last time, there were 100% projects that would have gotten prioritized over others had we not had the 20% small organization set aside. So I do think a 10% would make it fair for all the other applicants.
And I wanted to see if we could go back to the other slide.
Yeah.
Okay, because I know in the last funding round, we did say 38% of the money allocated went to homeownership, right? And I think that in round 15, was co-ops part of homeownership as well?
Yes, so that, the co-op, I broke it out, and it's across, the 2 that were funded that you see at the very bottom were for the round 15, part of that. So I wanted you to see where co-ops landed in the whole scheme of what's been funded. And right now, we still haven't determined where co-ops should land, and so that is still a discussion item for us to continue to evaluate how that would fit into these proposed funding tracks.
Okay, perfect. So I know it's kind of like aggregated or put together, and the co-op is kind of like a newer type
Right.
thing. Because, so from the last round specifically, I know that really only like 4.5 went to specific home ownership. And I think that if we are taking down the percentage, because right here it says homeownership, I think it was the one before this. They were saying homeownership got about 25%, was it? Is that what
Yeah.
this is saying?
Of the words that have been recommended, home ownership's received about 27.4%, which is actually higher than the overall that's been, well, it's about what has been requested. They requested 27.99% and have been recommended for awards for 27.4% of the $116 million that's been awarded by the Trust Fund Commission.
Okay, that makes sense. I think that putting even more money toward rentals is, and taking, from the other two, I think we should put more toward homeownership specifically, because I do believe that if people they don't own things, they don't feel like they're a part of the communities. And even with people who have been in foster care or homeless, the more that they feel like they're a part of the community and they're invested in it, we're using taxpayer money. So I think that we should put it towards something that's gonna build for the future, because let's say after the time period of 30 years or something, and the rentals keep rising, right? They don't own anything at the end of the day. So as rent rises, they're just gonna push out communities. And I feel like that's why it's so important to allow people to stay in their homes and do owner-occupied rehab, because it's setting a precedent. We're showing people that we actually do believe that you can pass on the homes to the next generation of people and not push people out of their neighborhoods. So I think that is just something that I have said to note.
Thank you for your comments.
I have a concern as well. It's the screen before this one where you had, for the rental, you're going to allow for-profit businesses to do that. And I'm concerned, just like Jayla, about the impact of the overriding rentals over home ownership by allowing for-profit businesses to get into this, because right now they're not in it, and it's still overriding home ownership by a great number, and then allowing the push for profits. And yes, it would definitely probably fill the gap for the housing that Nashville needs, but at what price?
Thank you. And this is directly from the UHS recommendations for the for-profits, and we're reflecting that here. We're going to move to a section a little bit about the for-profit piece. This is really starting with the funding track, though, conversation. And so I've heard from two commissioners that balancing more toward home ownership and rather than the rental is a priority potentially. This isn't a place yet for a vote or anything. We're starting to filter up what the priorities are of the commission for the next funding round. So thank you for that.
And I would just like to add maybe from my experience of working with folks that are really in that 30% and below, I think a lot of our home ownership initiatives are not at that AMI. And so I think I just would like to strongly advocate that from my perspective, this split feels in alignment. And I think very often with our rental initiatives, there's a lot of layers we have to do with subsidies and operating expenses, but that's very often how we are perhaps ending someone's homelessness to then hopefully they can move along that housing continuum. I think we need all different types, but I think I would strongly advocate for, I think the 60% for rental, just as we're making that deeply affordable housing a priority as well.
Thank you. Oh, forgot a crucial slide though. But we had proposed a different makeup than the first one. If this were at the second alternative that has rental at 70%, home ownership at 27%, and owner occupied at 3%, this is what, with an estimated $19 million funding round, it's going to be a little bit more than that, but we just used round numbers. This is what it would break down to. So just a comment from the work session about right sizing. We do have a smaller pool of money this year, so figuring out how to right size funding tracks to get quality and impactful results is something to think about too. So, but this is what the numbers would look like at that 70, 27, and 3%, and then a 10% small work set aside. That would require a code change before, which I don't see happening before round 16, so I should have used the 20%. The next area in the unified housing strategy, our consultants, HR&A, looked at our contracts, our compliance, and felt that there are areas to really improve enforcement to get projects to market faster. These include establishing progress milestones in the contract. We really just have a 24-month period. There are some draw schedules, but they're not really tied to timelines, and so that's one of the things that was lifted up. And then the UHS does recommend precluding grantees that don't meet milestones from additional funding until delays are resolved. That's another area in which our consultants identified limit amendment approvals, and that can be based on, again, meeting milestones that were set, that maybe the progress was not under the control of the grantee, like a natural disaster or some things, but some might be. And then clawbacks, and this is something where we would have to work with legal on what we can legally include as clawbacks for failure to meet obligations. These would require both some commission policy decision and direction, as well as council action if we're going to change the 24-month contract term to expand it maybe to 3 years, but limit then subsequent amendments if project haven't progressed in 36 months instead of 24 months. So those are just some examples of ways to increase enforcement around project progress. So I'll pause there for discussion. Okay, done. We'll move to the next item. Okay, the other thing that the Unified Housing Strategy discussed is moving the Barnes Fund from a grant program to a grant and loan fund. This has substantial legal implications for this to happen. So this requires a lot of council approval, legal analysis, staff capacity. I'm jumping ahead to the bottom. But one of the reasons this was recommended is Barnes Fund in and of itself is not sustainable with its funding. It relies every year on Metro Council operating budget and appropriations. A very small portion of the Barnes Fund does come from the city's capture of the short-term rental tax that is available to local governments, but other than that, everything else is part of the operating budget. And council members have to choose, salary increases for Metro employees, other services, along with funding the Barnes Fund. So when you create a loan fund, you can create some capital that recirculates back in as loans are repaid. Various types of loan funds have forgivable loans for projects that can't pay debt. The reason that the consultants proposed moving to for-profits, particularly just allowing LIHTC developers who are finding a nonprofit to partner with to get Barnes Fund, to just straight up apply for Barnes Fund and get a loan and pay debt back, because most often can pay some debt back on a low interest loan. And there's a lot of work behind this, but we did want to surface it because there's a lot of conversation about it. This would not be something used for owner-occupied rehab projects. Those are always excluded from loan funds. Those are always treated as grants. But that's why you saw the for-profit piece mentioned in the funding track and that debt structure it's coming from this recommendation in the unified housing strategy. So there's a lot to unpack here, a lot that's still unknown that we have to work through as a city if this is ultimately a direction that we want to move to.
I mean, I'm really am in support of it just because our funding sources are not secure in the future. We don't have a dedicated source of funding. And there's like a lot of really great projects that would succeed if even with a low interest rate loan. Like I'm thinking about home ownership projects. Like we could over years turn it into a huge cycling fund. I guess specific types of rental, like it would make sense to have flexibility to do both grants or both loan or separately loans, like anything, like if we're talking permanent supportive housing or 0 to 30, it would basically have to be grants or really, really low interest loans, but I'm intrigued by this idea.
And Director, could you, I guess, provide a little more, do you have any more context in terms of, I know that the UH has looked at a lot of different other case studies, and we've had some conversations about some other cities we've looked at that have had something similar, and how that has informed where your consultants, what they picked and choose from and said, this probably makes the most sense. Would that, I guess a part of it is just assuming that was the case, and then another part of that conversation would be, or my question would be, if we were to move towards that direction, would the conversation take place exclusively within, between housing staff and Metro Council? What role would we as a commission play in that conversation?
I'll start with the commission, and Macy can weigh in if I get out of line on your role, but your role is to be the guiding body, the oversight of the fund and the direction of it. So I would say you have a very active role in the policy direction and how things are implemented and the timeline on when things are implemented. We wouldn't want to act outside of the commission's will to take something directly to council that wasn't supported by the commission, and having vetted with this takes a lot of ramp up, having worked on the home program when it moved to requiring underwriting and changed capacity requirements. It took several years working with organizations to understand what this looks like, to create the infrastructure internally to be able to review projects. This goes hand in hand. You have to have strong underwriting in place before you can do this. You have to have loan servicing in place. That's usually contracted. And so there's a whole heavy lift in moving to a model like this. If it is something that is interested, and the council could also give direction without the commission. That's their role. To something like this, we would want to be very deliberate and intentional on how this would move forward. Yeah, and I'll leave it to Macy to maybe correct me.
No, that was perfect. You all, in your role would make maybe recommendations to the Metro Council. Angie and her team would, I'm sure, have some conversations with the mayor's office to make sure they were supportive of anything before we sent it to the Metro Council.
Okay, I did have a question. If we start to bring loans into it, do you think that that's going to cause our budget to go down, on the grant level? And then my other question is, if we start the loan process, right, with the nonprofits and the businesses, will they be a personal guarantor? Do they have to have business credit? And what would that kind of look like?
That would be in the underwriting and the loan requirements that would be established as part of the loan. program. I cannot speak to whether, if we move to this model, how Metro Council would treat the budget. I wish they could always fund it at a robust level, but
I guess I've worked in communities where they have more of this model, but I think there's a lot of really clear parameters around partnerships to ensure that our for-profit partners aren't necessarily unduly influencing how projects advance. So I'm just curious, maybe this is later, or maybe it's what we're in the process of figuring out of how do we preserve kind of other stakeholders' perspective, if this is truly just kind of clearing the path for who's applying for the financing, but knowing that we have some special priorities with this particular fund, I'm curious how maybe shifting to a loan model would affect our partnerships.
I'll reflect, and it wasn't in the recap, but one of our longstanding nonprofit partners at the last meeting reminded the commission of its mission around why this fund was created. And even with the Catalyst Fund, which is a fund we have created with Metro, it lives, we took $25 million of rescue plan funds and have leveraged that with $50 million of bank financing and philanthropic, and it's used for a totally different purpose than what this is, but it is to work with mission-driven and mission-aligned partners. And so we would always want to keep those missions forefront to be able to achieve and serve the people that need the housing the most, and we can set those, the commission can set those parameters. And part of the underwriting includes developer assessment and capacities and really understanding those partnerships beyond the expertise that we currently have at staff level. All right, well, we'll move to the last part, which is underwriting criteria. And I know there's been a lot of questions about it, and I'm still going to say I probably can't answer the deep questions yet because we don't have the underwriting criteria. But the purpose, as we're talking about it here, it's not the same type of underwriting as if you're buying the house and what you're able to afford. What we're talking about here is evaluating how much public resources should be invested in a project. Are we investing more than a project really needs to make the deal work? And that really hasn't been an assessment that's been made in the past. It's also a strong underwriting criteria validates the ownership structure and assesses developer capacity. Then our process for establishing underwriting, we have funding in our budget, and this isn't just for barns. This is for whenever we are looking at one of our mixed income pilot, one of the other tools that we're creating, we need to have underwriting to know how much we are incentivizing or investing in regardless of what the tool is. But we are working with Metro Finance on getting a contractor on board to establish the underwriting criteria, and then also to underwrite projects until we can grow internal capacity. So that might be a couple of years. That procurement timeline we're looking at probably going through December. At first, we thought we might be able to use an existing contractor with Metro Finance. That's something we're exploring that could hopefully move this faster. But this will not be something that'll be in place before we would want to open round 16. And I'll talk about that, what that looks like in next steps. But ultimately, when we go through this, the commission's role would be to approve any underwriting policies for the Barnes Fund. So that would be in your purview. So as Catherine, next slide. So in the interim, some potential short-term criteria to use is, again, using funding caps, but also adding in subsidy limits per unit or per bedroom. HUD for the home program does create a subsidy limit per unit, and creating a matrix depending on unit size or bedrooms, we can look at how that could be achieved. Incorporate some of the home underwriting criteria for rental and homeownership projects, including a subsidy layering review. Subsidy layering review is all the different capital and how it filters in and what's necessary, what costs are reasonable, and then assessing the firm commitment of firm written financial commitments, which we saw that a lot in round 15. It can be not firm, not provided, and so underwriting would really increase. And that gets us to speed to market faster with more feasible projects as well. So that's it on right now where we are with the underwriting criteria.
So to go forward with creating the subsidy limit matrix, so you guys have shown me an initial version, but I'd love to, if you could bring it forward for a discussion, like even at the next session.
Yeah, so Catherine, could you go to the next slide? We'll just go ahead and jump ahead, and then we can come back to this. So what we're looking at, and we'll preview, we've talked internally, it hasn't been anything, but feasibly a February funding round opening. We really need to have the funding round opened and at least through the commission approval process during budget discussions so that we are signaling that we are moving Barnes Fund money. So in October, we anticipate bringing forward discussion items, the round 16 timeline, policy priorities based on the feedback we've received today and what we'll hear from the members of the audience, the potential round 16 underwriting criteria for you to review. We would like to have a presentation on cooperative housing so we can get more clarity on where that should land in a funding round. And then at your December meeting, coming back with items for you to finally vote on and give direction. And then James is working on a separate application manual that works functionally like a procurement manual, but we don't do procurements, we do applications, but that's just the whole process around things that doesn't get muddied into a grant policy. So that's what we're looking at as next steps. And then in between in November, working with stakeholders in the homeownership space, rental space, and owner-occupied rehab to filter and really refine some of the comments that we've heard and really understand the practical implications of some of the directions we might be going in.
I think for the, kind of per unit underwriting, I think I go back obviously to PSH is what I am, thinking about through this lens, and knowing that it's being examined in a more kind of specific space is exciting, but also knowing our timeline and knowing that likely is not going to be developed by round 16, are there considerations for underwriting for PSH, like having a higher per unit cap when we know we're not going to have a lot of revenue, and just thinking through, are there ways that we're building that into upcoming funding, or is it more we're need to figure out some of these other kind of threads we're pulling before leveraging kind of Barnes capital for additional PSH?
We would submit alternatives for PSH and deeply affordable housing. The UHS does speak to deeper incentives for housing with those policy priorities in them and what that would ultimately look like. Well, if that's it, that concludes my presentation, and we have a little over 15 minutes for public comments. Chair, if the commission has no other discussion items.
Further questions from the commission? All right, let's open up for public comment in our remaining period. We'll do by show of hands. All right, come on up. Yeah, come on up, and then I think Matt, Andy, was that you, Mick?
Please make sure that you say your name because we are being recorded for anybody who's watching.
Thank you, Catherine. This is Terry Rapune, Westminster Home Connection. Thank you for having this, and thank you for letting us comment. I want to make just a couple of really, I think, important follow-up comments. I really appreciate that you're focused on funding what Metro and you're preferred unified housing strategy says we need, and not what historically the nonprofit advocates have wanted to do. So I think that's critical. I would really, really like to ask that you do not base the allocated percentages on what has been applied for and awarded in the past. And the reason for that is that it perpetuates rewarding what people want to do and not what the community actually needs and wants most. And I will tell you, of course, you know, I'm going to speak specifically about owner-occupied rehab. So the owner-occupied rehab suggested number is 3% based on the history of what's been applied for. We have built our capacity as a community to do more owner-occupied rehab repairs. The math here of 570,000 for owner-occupied rehab, Westminster will probably apply for that. We got almost $500,000 in round 15. We are out of funding. We have completed round 13. Rebuilding did not get funded. I don't know who else in the repair capacity is out there, but it's not just us, right? So I would strongly ask that you build your percentages based on what you need and not what's historically been applied for. Because if neither Westminster and Rebuilding and any others, there'll only one of us be funded in the next round if it's limited to 570,000. I personally would say 30%, right? 30%, that would be, I don't know, or maybe 25%. I don't know what it is, but it's a much bigger number because I think our capacity is higher. The other thing I want to say is that owner-occupied rehab is a priority. It's the shortest timeline, it's the highest need for resources, and it's a huge impact at D27 in the Unified Housing Strategy. I also want to say that there's 11,000 cost-burdened older adult homeowners in Metro, according to Metro Social Services Community Needs Evaluation. That's just older adult cost-burdened homeowners. Doesn't include people with disabilities and other populations. So there's a huge opportunity. And given that the cost of rehabbing these homes is anywhere from $5,000 to $25,000 on average, it makes a big impact and it's immediate. There's no extensions requested. You know, we've run out of 13 and we're not 24 months in yet. We can get this money to use immediately. So, thank you.
That wasn't my alarm, that's a timer. Timing y'all, 2 minutes. Thanks, Terry.
Good afternoon. I'm Matt Busher with the Pathway Housing Fund. Thank you, commissioners, for your service, and thank you for the great presentation. You all have an impossible task. You know that. This is the only tool that's available from the public to address what is by far the most demanding need in our city right now. The polling says that, the population says it, and you know it. And there are so many needs, from homeownership to permanent supportive housing, from rental. And so my request, and I'm not sure that this body is really even in a position to do it, but for you all to know the most effective way to allocate the scarce resources that you have. And they are diminishing. This year's allocation is less than half of last year's. In order for you all to figure out how best to do that, I think it is imperative that we take the incredible work from the Unified Housing Strategy and contextualize both the specific objectives of where we're trying to go as a city, what the costs are to achieve each of those. How many units of permanent supportive housing do we need? What's the cost per unit to do that? How much can be applied by the public sector versus the private sector? And until we have specific goals and targets for what it is we're trying to do and how we intend to get there and what the community needs to bring to bear, these conversations are difficult to have because it is a mountain of a problem and you're trying to figure out how best to apply the scarce resources that you have. I, of course, think the most cost-effective way to deploy those scarce resources are to hold on, to preserve the affordable housing that we still have in the city. Demonstrably, it is the most effective. We can use loans to do it. But when you're balancing a grant versus a loan, how do you compare that? That is a difficult comparison to make. And I think the overall challenge of figuring out how to allocate these resources is almost impossible unless you know the specific role that this entity is supposed to play and how best to deploy those dollars. And so I implore you to ask for that broader context so you can know how to best fulfill your responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Andy up next, followed by Nick.
Hey everyone, this is Andy Zhu with MFX Ventures. Nice to see you all again. I want to touch on a couple of items. The first was being very strongly in support. I've said it several times. I'm going to keep saying it for, the new commissioners on the table. This underwriting thing of how much dollars goes to which type of property, which type of project is so important in terms of, as Matt mentioned, making sure that we put the investment in the right locations. I wanted to elevate the loan discussion as I think Jayla mentioned, hey, is this going to take away from potential grants? And encourage that discussion to be something where if you are, and I think a lot of the people in the audience would agree, especially on the LIHTC side, long-term, low-interest rate debt would, obviously grants are the best, right? But long-term, low-interest rate debt could be much more sustainable for the city and provide almost as good of a job if in a sufficient enough quantity for the size of the projects. And so if you can lobby the city as your positioners on the Barnes Commission and say, we would like more money to loan out, that then brings revenue back and recycles over the long term, I think it could be a great way, and I will keep pushing for that, and I hope you all will too. The other thing I wanted to mention is on the discussion on for-profit versus nonprofit and wanting to make sure that the priorities of the city are being addressed. I think if you're not in the housing development space, you probably don't realize that being a nonprofit or for-profit can be kind of a shell game sometimes. There are plenty of for-profit companies that operate much better housing quality and there are plenty of nonprofit companies that are kind of a shell just to make money, frankly. What I think that you all should be prioritizing, if you can, in your priorities is saying, hey, does this housing allow someone to raise the rent on this tenant 3 times in a year, right? Whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit company running that, it shouldn't matter. I'll also add just very quickly, it also excludes currently faith-based institutions. We were working with several from applying for nonprofit funding because they're not technically 501c3s. So there's a couple other reasons why you all might want to consider, like, what are the priorities that we're trying to fund instead? Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Mick, I have you next on the list.
Is this on already? There we go.
Mick Nelson, Nelson Community Partners. The matrix that we looked at earlier with all the different applications, I think was really helpful, but I think it was missing one really important piece of data, which is the amount of units that were created and funded. I just want to keep on drawing us attention to this. We need 9,000 units a year, 2,000 of which need to be affordable to meet the unified housing strategy. And I think, to Matt's point earlier, that should be a guiding light in our discussion. And we know that we need it towards the lower end of the income spectrum. I was doing some research the other day, going back to my old life as an academic, and found that there are 50,000 households in Davidson County that earn less than $40,000 a year. The maximum rent that those 50,000 households can pay is about $1,000 a month. We have 21,000 units of housing right now, less than $1,000, that rents for less than $1,000 a month. So we have 21,000 units and 50,000 households looking for those units. So I just want to draw us attention to that gap. That's where the biggest gap is. One thing is, so I want to focus on units. I think this is what we should be focusing on. I think a clear point when we're talking about the distribution of funds is we need more resources to address this need. And this conversation gets whether it should be 3% or 25% or 50% or 70%, gets a lot easier if those numbers are bigger. And we can get enough for everyone to do the important work that this room has the capacity to carry out. So I want to keep everyone's eye on that ball too, is that we need more resources to address these needs. One point I'd make, and without having seen it, I don't necessarily know that caps per unit subsidy-wise are the ideal mechanism for allocating these resources. I think if we're comparing and we have a graduated system or maybe a comparative like bell curve scoring system where we evaluate the subsidy per unit of different projects, that's a way to push everyone to be as efficient as possible with their resources and their ask. So I think caps, everyone will go for the top, which we just saw, whereas we want to motivate just to get the bare minimum necessary to keep the project moving forward. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate all your work.
All right, thank you, Mick. Yeah. All right. Andrea, come on up.
Hi, Andrea Prince with Rebuilding Together Nashville. I wanted to also second that we just need more resources into the pot. But when looking at this next funding round and how funds are going to be allocated, that 3% for rehab is a little bit disheartening of just seeing that it is a priority of the UHS. It was one of the top priorities. Also, older adults who we work with, and for Rebuilding Together too, of the kind of wraparound supportive services we're able to provide. We're working on state planning, like we're tackling a lot of the issues that are addressed in the UHS. We were ready to do, $2.2 million in the last round. So hearing that there might only be $480,000 available for all of us in the next funding round is a little worrisome. I think also if that continues to, that's annual applications that we'll have to be doing, which is also really burdensome for a small nonprofit like us. So, now with a larger kind of portion, we can have multi-year funding that can kind of get us through, which is great. And having to continually reapply a very lengthy application annually for a much smaller amount is pretty burdensome for small nonprofits trying to do this work.
Thank you, Andrea.
Could I ask a brief question to Andrea and Terry about rehabs?
Sure, make it quick.
So just like ballpark number, if you guys were working together at full capacity, like what numbers would we be talking about to fully fund owner-occupied rehab in Nashville?
Well, I can only speak for our piece. We do 200 houses a year in Davidson County, and a lot of that's funded by, oh, sorry. Sorry, I forgot we were being recorded. We do 200 houses a year in Davidson County, and a lot of that is funded by others. So we're building our capacity right now. The question, I think, is not just us, but it's also, there are others as well. I would say that we could use easily, we've actually budgeted in our projections $300,000 a year from Barnes, ongoing. That's what our capacity is today. So what it would be in the future, I don't know.
Yeah, and so our projects, we typically are a little bit maybe larger scale. And so we're looking at, we had projected out 85 homes over the next 2 years. That was, 2 million, 2.2. And so really looking at, but we've been building capacity. Last year we did 57 homes and wanted to continue growing on that. So, for me, looking at to our different target communities, put $1 million in each year, $3 million a year. We want to expand to a third target community. So really kind of looking at how can we continue to grow capacity. We've been kind of really building up over the past couple of years so that we could do more. And so, we'll put it at 3 million over 100 homes.
Thank you.
All right, Lucille.
Lucille Houseworth, Habitat of Greater Nashville. And I just wanted to say, I agree how important all of these categories are. And we've done that kind of work, the rehab work, and that is incredibly important. But so is creating new units. When we look at the growth of this city and really new affordable units, the people that are service workers here, hospitality workers, medical aides in the hospitals, bus drivers at the schools, those kinds of jobs and those kinds of salaries, those people that are serving our growing community need new places to live. And the number of 9,000 new units, many of which are affordable, was mentioned. So, of course, we need more money. But I want to just make sure that we're looking at all of the categories that are needed for the city. The other thing I just wanted to add is that in our case, doing new home ownership, we start with the property. Generally speaking, we own the property before we get the Barnes funding because it would be impossible really to acquire the property, do the development, build the homes, sell the homes, and all of that within any of these timeframes. But when we do the development work, we're doing things like sidewalks, roads, sewers, other utilities that's paid for with the grant funds, and those infrastructure components are then turned back over to the city when the project is complete. So I think that speaks to how much of the funds needs to be in grants versus in loans, because the grant piece helps us to fund that then really is turned over to infrastructure for the city. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lucille. So we have reached, Josh, if you can do like 30 seconds.
Hey guys, Josh Haston with LDG Development. Thank you guys all for your time and all you're doing for the city. I want to second all these comments that have been said, especially about more funding. Regarding goals, I think Matt touched on this earlier. These deals take so long to put together. It's good for all of us in this audience to know your goals. So when we're structuring contracts, we're understanding how many units at 30% do we need to build into this pro forma? How many units at 60% do we need to build in this pro forma? So if we understand your goals, we can structure that in the meantime. I think that's also alignment with the UHS as well. Regarding underwriting, love it. Let's keep on down that pathway. I hope that there's more feedback for this audience to provide further criteria and how that could or should be structured based on the specific type of deal that it is and that population that you're trying to serve. Also, kudos to the allowing or even the thought about for-profit versus nonprofit. Again, another person mentioned earlier about the deal structure doesn't necessarily look that different if you're a for-profit versus a nonprofit, because again, the banks are just looking at, can you make the mortgage payment? So it's understanding that. Timelines, again, really thankful for all the timelines that are laid out here. Looking at round 16, I'm hoping that there's some alignment in how the THDA's funding rounds may come out in the 9% and the 4%. Their QAP was just approved this morning at their board meeting, so hopefully there's some coordination there where potential round 16 may help with those 2026 deals to get your money out the door faster. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Josh. All right, we have reached the end of our time in this room. We need to get out. I hope to see most of you in 1 month on October 28th. We stand adjourned.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.